is Christian Takushi, your independent macroeconomist and geopolitical strategist, coming to you with something that I believe consensus and our Western media are overlooking, not reporting. There are two things that I believe you should be aware of. Two very important things. First, the BRICS are overtaking the G7 in their share of the world economy. This is a big deal. And the second thing is that a large number of countries, soon the rest of the world actually, is declaring war on the US dollar. They would like to actually reduce their dependence on the US dollar and our Western banking system. These are big developments, and unfortunately, they are not being really sufficiently reported and commented here in the West. And I like to add value. As you probably have noticed, I don't come to you every week, every day. I only come to you when I believe I can add value and I should add value. And I would like to report to you today an analysis of the perspective of the rest of the world, because it's so insufficiently reported here in the West, or is completely overlooked. And we're not talking about football or some sports event, which is also very important, or some musical event. No, we're talking about something that may affect our lives and our decisions, our families even, quite soon. We're talking about the leading emerging countries becoming bigger than the rich economies. They have overtaken, so the 5 leading emerging nations have overtaken the largest 7 rich economies. This is quite significant, because the smaller your economy, the smaller your influence in the world, and the bigger your economy, the more your influence in the world. And the other issue has also dramatic significance for us in the West. The rest of the world trying to diversify away from the US dollar, trying to cut off even from the US dollar in our banking system, means that the West, Europe, North America, will not be able to live beyond its means. The West, we have been living beyond our means. We have been running a very reckless monetary and fiscal policy for the last 40-50 years. For the last 40-50 years, the West has been able to run very irresponsible fiscal excesses and monetary excesses because the whole world has to use the dollar. We've been able to use our US dollar hegemony and our Western banking hegemony in a way to get away with our fiscal and monetary excesses. And if the rest of the world has had enough of us, we won't be able to continue doing that, which means our excessive consumption and our excessive lifestyle will have to be adjusted, and this will have a massive impact on the lifestyle of many people that are going to be listening or watching this. That's why I bring it to you. I don't want to repeat to you what you can read in our Western media or financial media, because you probably are bombarded with that. I will bring to you today the perspective from the rest of the world, from the Far East, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. What are the most important leaders in these 5 regions saying and talking about in the last couple of weeks? Something quite remarkable. The majority of them seem to agree on the fact that most of what the world has seen and witnessed over the past 2 years, 2.5 years, is being directed against them. These, they believe, are mostly efforts. This crisis that we see the last 2 years, that are efforts of the West to contain the emerging markets, to disrupt the rise of emerging markets. Now, they are not always in agreement. Some of them believe that these are just things that happen by coincidence, a convergence of bad things, crisis, bad luck, and the West is just taking advantage of them to hurt the emerging markets because they are becoming too powerful. But there are other leaders in the global South and East that believe that we in the West have orchestrated all this and organized all this on purpose to hurt them. And it's also remarkable how little we see how little is reported in our Western media about how our policies, our actions have been really hurting emerging markets and decimating emerging markets. We don't hear that so much. It's obvious and it's understandable. I don't want to go into any conspiracy theory. People say that the media is just lying to us. No, I don't want to go there because in times of conflict, the media does not report everything. In times of war and conflict, it's understandable that our media cannot report everything. So it's understandable to some extent, and it has always been the same in times of war that our media may not be able to report things that do not corroborate our narrative or our interest, national interest, right? But it is the role, I believe, of responsible, independent analysts to try to bring a balanced analysis to the public, but in a responsible way as well. You will not hear me, for instance, sharing things that could affect our national security. Because it has to be done in a responsible way. But there are things that I believe heads of families, decision makers, business owners, and investors in general in the West need to know to protect themselves, possibly even to take advantage of some of these opportunities, because risks are also opportunities. As a Swiss-based macroeconomist and geopolitical analyst, I believe that it is my duty to draw attention to the growing consensus in the global East and the global South that is so negative and critical about the West. And it is remarkable because the consensus is quite strong already there. And I haven't used the word anger, but a lot of the East and the South is pretty angry at the West. They are hurting and they believe we're doing this against them because we don't want them to rise. We can probably avoid it. The BRICS have really overtaken this year the leading rich 7 nations, the G7, and that's going to continue. I mean, that trend is not going to be able to be stopped. But let me go back to what I wanted to do. What are these countries in the East and the South thinking? What are their leaders thinking? And their leaders are not just a few. This is a majority of the leaders, I would say. We have currently 29 nations that have come together. Some of them are actually even adversaries, enemies, competitors. They're coming together in their joint interest to decouple from the West. You could say, some people would say, 28 nations are rallying around China to reduce their dependence on the West, on the US dollar. And these 29 nations, including China, represent 62% of the world population. 62% of the world, and it's growing. I mean, every 2 weeks you have 1 or 2 more countries joining them. Well, so we're not talking about just some people. No, leaders representing 62% of the world population are saying this. And I'm trying to be as objective as possible. They're saying that our energy policies of the last few years are designed to increase the price of energy. Our policies to increase the prices of food and the massive food price inflation our commerce and trade policies and other policies are directed to increase the price of goods to affect them. We also have liquidity restrictions. You may not have heard about that, but many countries no longer have access to US dollars. They need US dollars, but there is a shortage of US dollars. You may have heard of some banks even having problems in the US. For us in the West, some banks may be collapsing, but for these countries means not being able to feed their people, right? So emerging countries are facing, not all of them, but some of them are facing a terrible shortage of US dollars. And then there is the war in Ukraine and talk of war in Taiwan, China eventually invading Taiwan. Well, and I could go on and on, but they're saying that all of the things that are happening in the last 2 years are specially directed at them, against them. And indeed, for instance, food prices have gone up by 10% here in the West, in some countries even more, like 20%, close to 20% in the UK. Sounds quite bad, right? But in some of these developing or emerging nations, food prices have increased by 30, 40, 50, 60%. It's a much more dramatic situation for them. And approaches for it. And I think that we need to pay attention to this, because over the past 10 months, 12 months, our Western leaders have also threatened many of these nations with sanctions. And unfortunately, some of our leaders have also hinted at seizing their foreign exchange reserves. That means us taking away their savings. So if they have savings in US dollars or euros, we have threatened them with taking away their savings, basically. You could actually say they are afraid that we will do to them what we have done to Russia. Of course, they don't want to invade their neighbor, but some of these nations have said, and I quote, some Western nations says that if we make the same mistake as Qatar and we don't implement our gender policies, we will, if they don't implement our gender policies, we will eventually seize their foreign exchange reserves, which means their savings in US dollars, in euros, etc. So they are quite confused and upset and angry and actually worried about their financial situation. Actually, the majority of them have been already quite angry at our monetary and fiscal excesses of the past 40, 50 years. As you know, the West has been living beyond its means, spending much more than what it has, spending much more than what it earns, and making up for the difference with printing money. And the rest of the world had to take and accept our printed dollars and printed euros. That's what we've been doing. And in the West, we can get away with that because they have to use our currencies. If Argentina, Brazil, or India would dare to do the same, we, our financial markets, we investors would hammer them down. We would punish them brutally, and their interest rates will go to 20 or 30%. But we in the West, financial markets, and I think I know what I'm talking about because I'm a former fund manager, we don't do that. When Italy, Germany, or France, or the United States behaves irresponsibly with its monetary or fiscal policy, we close an eye. We say, well, we are the West, and the US is risk-free. The US Treasury is a risk-free investment, is the anchor for our financial theory and financial markets. And since Western Europe is the extension of the US market, we can print money, we can't be hopelessly indebted, but our interest rates, they can be 1% or 2%, 3%, even 0%. But if other countries would behave the same way, would do the same that we do, we punish them. We demand 10%, 15%, 20% interest rate on their government debt. So this is actually the main reason why most of the rest of the world has been wanting has been desiring to decouple from the US dollar. They said, let's put an end to this. Let the Americans and the Europeans deal with their own problems. We don't want to have their currency. But it's been just a desire, wishful thinking, because they have to use dollars to buy food. They have to use dollars to buy oil. They have to use dollars to raise funds. So it's been just wishful thinking for them. They have been lamenting and complaining about our fiscal and monetary excesses for 20, 30 years, but they have been afraid of doing that because they said if they would do that, the West would hit at them, right? Well, but finally, the rise of the BRICS was imminent. I mean, for the last 3 years, the rest of the world has been expecting the imminent moment when the BRICS would overtake the G7, the rich nations. Well, it has happened this year, and of course, it didn't happen suddenly. The IMF, the World Bank, the BIS, the central banks, they knew for the last 3 years this was imminent, this was happening. And so leaders in Asia, Africa, and Latin America believe that we in the West have been either orchestrating this crisis against them or taking advantage of this crisis to hurt them. And they have declared this last couple of weeks war on the US dollar. I would say a kind of economic war. Economic hostilities have begun. We see it as a war, but they actually see this simply as liberation. For us, it is a war on our US dollars and euros, pound sterling, Japanese yen. It is a war on our lifestyle, because if they don't use our currencies anymore, our lifestyle is going to go down to what the level that we can afford. So it is an economic war against it, but for them, it's just liberation. They want to liberate themselves from our dominion, from our currency, monetary hegemony over the world market, over the world financial system. And it matters, ladies and gentlemen, because if the rest of the world join forces as it is doing now, it's going to have dramatic impact on us. And I want to remind you of the following. Some people may say, well, it doesn't really matter what they think, right? It does. We, for instance, sanctioned Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine, right? We put massive sanctions on Russia. They are not working. They are not. Actually, Europe is buying a lot of Western Europe is buying a lot of Russian oil and gas, not directly, but via other countries. We're just paying much more than we used to pay. Some other people are making profits of that. And when we impose those sanctions, our experts and leaders said, we're going to crush the Russian economy. It's going to implode by 10%, maybe 12%. We're going to crush them. The truth is, Russia is not the economic growth of the Russian economy is not better or worse than the German economy or the British economy. Basically, Britain and Germany are not growing more than Russia. And the worst part of this is the moral decay, because the rest of the world sees Europe. The rest of the world doesn't believe in the American moral standing or the high ground of America. They don't believe in that for years anymore, not since the second Iraq war and Afghanistan. But at least they thought that Europe has a bit of moral standing, but they no longer respect us either, because they say we are threatening other countries for buying Russian oil and gas, but they say correctly, we are the biggest buyers to some extent. We are some of the biggest buyers. We try to hit and threaten India with big sanctions, and every time we've done it, India has reacted and says this is absolute hypocrisy. You guys in Europe buy more Russian oil and Russian gas than we do, right? And India has been speaking the truth. We have been hypocritical about that. Not only that, the sanctions have not been working. Why? But why didn't the sanctions work? Because the rest of the world because the emerging markets and developing markets didn't believe our narrative. They said, some of them said, we think that Russia and the West is responsible for this. And some of these countries even think that the West organized all this. So they just don't want to take sides. They don't want to put sanctions on Russia. And the interesting thing is we have threatened many of these countries. So they voted with us at the United Nations, but we could not threaten them enough for them to impose sanctions on Russia. So most of the countries that voted with us, I mean, these countries in the non-Western world, they voted with us at the UN, but they didn't impose any sanctions on Russia. So actually, when it comes down to the sanctions on Russia, the West is quite isolated. And this is actually a difficulty. What these emerging markets think, it does matter. It matters because our sanctions didn't work. It didn't work because most of the world is not supporting them. Actually, big countries like India, China, South Africa, Brazil, etc., are kind of, saying we will put our national interests first. And that means that our sanctions against Russia are not working. And that should actually illustrate to you that the West is no longer as powerful as it used to be. Dear friends, we're coming from a world where the Western economies represented 80% of the world economy. 80%. It's just a bit more than 40% now. 40%. A bit more than 40%. It's really quite remarkable. And the economies of the developing countries, they used to be just 20% of the world economy. They now represent more than 50% of the world economy. More than 50%. These are gigantic shifts. This is happening right at this time. So what the thought leaders in Asia and Latin America and Africa are saying is, please pay attention, because most of what is happening in the world the last 2 years and this year is related to this struggle between the rich nations and the emerging markets that are rising. And they say most of these crises, not everything probably, but most of these crises are the efforts of the West to try to change the trajectory, to try to slow down the rise of the emerging markets. And I think this is very important that we just try to listen to them and not judge whether they're right or not. And I really disagree with some of their views. But one thing I don't do is I try not to overlook it, because these nations are now even economically more powerful than the West. So we have to pay attention to what they think, because if they think this way, their actions are going to have an effect, quite an impact on our standard of living sooner or later. Sooner or later. Why I say this? If they succeed in using less US dollars than they've been doing the last 10 years, 20 years, quite soon, we will have to pay more to raise funds. Our interest rates will have to rise. The risk premium on our debt will increase, and our asset bubbles will implode. And ladies and gentlemen, the West is full of asset bubbles. Yes, our Western governments have been inflating the value of house prices, bond prices, stock prices, private equity assets, many things. Many things in the West are inflated. The asset prices are inflated, and they're going up and up and up for the last 20 years. Our governments don't want to prick the bubble. They don't want the bubble to correct because it's too painful. And we should not blame our governments, because I think they would be short-sighted. It's actually the voters themselves, the citizens, the voters, they don't want any recession. They don't want any correction of asset prices. Our asset prices have been held up artificially by our governments, basically because we, the citizens, don't give them any other choice. Our problem is systemic, I think. Unfortunately, we didn't address it. Everyone in the West has been sitting in the same boat. Governments, central banks, media, financial media, pension funds, retirees, voters, banks, companies. Almost everyone is sitting in the same boat. So no one wanted to address our excesses and our bubbles, our big bubbles. They're quite gigantic. And now we enter a situation where we are at war and where the rest of the world is gathering forces, is coming together to put an end to our hegemony, to our control of the world financial market. So, an external force, the emerging markets, the rest of the world, might put an end to our excesses because we didn't do it internally. We could not muster the courage to do it when we could have done it. It might be that the emerging markets, the developing world, will actually rally together, come together, and put an end to our bubbles. That is actually the potential outcome of this. And this is why I believe that it is important for us to understand, or at least to pay attention to what the leaders in the global East and the global South are saying. Again, I would disagree with much of what they say, with a lot of their points, but whether I disagree or not, what they are saying matters because their economic power is now bigger than the economic power of the West. It's just happened. It's just a reality. It has happened, and we knew this was coming for the past few years. It is here. Please keep an eye on these three countries: India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, in that order. India is the leading rising emerging power, and almost everybody would like to have India in their alliance. Why is India so important? India has chosen a multi-aligned path. Everybody talks about multipolar world. That's a little bit of disinformation. Don't buy that. We're going into a transition, global transition, and that transition, the world is going to look like it is multipolar. But what the nations of the South and the East want is to be multi-aligned. So if they are willing to accept a multipolar world, it's because they want to be multi-aligned. And that's not the same. That's not the same. India wants to be able to buy important inputs from China. They want to buy weapons from Russia. But they want to sell the products and services to the US. Yes, that is to be multi-aligned. And it seems that we don't desire that here in the West. But it's coming. More and more countries in the world want to be multi-aligned. Have you known this? I think it's very important that we understand this. So India will attend our summits, but India will attend also a Russian summit. India will attend an African summit. And if China organizes a summit, India will attend it too. We make the huge mistake that just because India is shaking hands with us and coming to our summit, that we think that India is just with us. No. India believes in being multi-aligned. It wants to do business with everyone, everybody. But we in the West seem to have a problem with that. And we think that if anybody would talk to China or Russia, they are our enemies. We impose sanctions on them or we threaten them with sanctions. And I have to say that used to work. When we were 80% of the world economy, we had the power, our sanctions did work. But now the West has less economic power than emerging and developing countries. If we threaten sanctions on them, we have to be smart. We have to think twice. I don't say that we should never do sanctions, but we have to be smarter than that because they could backfire, and they are backfiring. Pay attention on Brazil as well and Saudi Arabia. And I've written to our readers about that. I don't have time to go on that, why you should pay attention on these countries, but India is the role model for most of these nations. India is very smart, very intelligent, and quite wise. They want to work with everyone. And when we threaten them, don't you talk to Russia, don't you buy Russian oil, otherwise we will sanction them, they say, go ahead. Go ahead. Put your threats in practice. Sanction us. And we've threatened them so many times. It's actually embarrassing because we've not been able to implement our threats against India because India is too big, too important for us to do that. It's actually embarrassing to threaten someone you cannot really sanction, right? Especially when India is right. We are buying, well, it's changing. India has had enough of the West in Europe, especially. They're buying a lot of Russian oil now. But until a few months ago, India was correct in saying, you guys in Europe are buying much more Russian oil and gas than we do. And you're threatening us for buying Russian oil and gas? Give us a break. And actually, it is remarkable, right, that our press would not report much about that. But it was all over the world. It was all over Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, China, Southeast Asia. These that I'm sharing you, the way we threaten India, and that India defended itself and says no, or go ahead, we're gonna follow you, we're gonna follow our own national interest. That was all over the world in the media doing headlines, except here in the West. And that's a pity, because the newspapers and journalists that would have reported that would have not been unpatriotic. They would have just been, I would say, careful and cautious and objective, because we need to be informed about that. That is not being pro-Russian or pro-China. This is just being patriotic. They're just being pro-Western, because we want to take smart decisions. If we go to war, let us do it smartly. If we want to fight China, let us fight wisely and smartly. And I have been saying for the last few years that we're making a lot of mistakes in the West. I care a lot about US and British and Swiss national security and European national security, and I've been saying all these years that what we are doing is counterproductive, that we're actually hurting our own national interest. Unfortunately, it's happening because not many people in our media, also in our governments and our think tanks and universities agreed with people like me that have been cautious about our energy policies and the dismantling of our military, etc., etc. So, and I'm not taking any sides here. I'm trying to be an objective, independent analyst, not taking sides, trying to be just constructive. And also helping people in the West make better decisions. And we have been making horrible decisions in the last 10 years that have been hurting and would hurt our interests a lot, and will continue to hurt our interests a lot. I also want to say something about the Middle East. What is happening right now in the world is not going to be good news for Israel. One of the reasons Israel had kind of relative peace was because the Sunnis were fighting the Shias and vice versa. But China has managed to bring peace to the Shias and the Sunnis. So the world is changing for Israel. And even Russia doesn't want to help Israel anymore. So, difficult times for the Middle East. And I think that that's a next front. We have war risk in Europe, escalation, risk of war in Asia, and a growing risk of war in the Middle East. Thank you for your kind attention. This is it. This is everything from me. I think I've said enough. And I want to thank you for your kind attention. This is Christian Takushi, your independent macroeconomist and geopolitical strategist, coming to you from Switzerland. Bye.